Alrighty, so here we are with my top 10 fantasy movies that I don't see enough people talking about, or that you've likely not seen all of. I don't know. How are we phrasing these? I just want to do a list of lesser known, and to be honest, the fantasy movies are a little harder to do because there are not a lot of them out there that are there to pick through that you can be familiar with. So this is you're likely to know all of these because the assortment of fantasy movies is thin. Now I was tempted to put some of my favorites that are absolutely ones you've never heard of. I There was one with like the Barbarian twins. That was just a blast of a movie, but that's more a comedic, fun movie than necessarily a fantasy movie. So these are specifically fantasy movies that you've likely not seen or nobody talks about enough. But you've probably heard of many of these. So when I say these are not necessarily my top of all time fantasy movies, but they are definitely ones that I wish more people knew about or had watched. So starting with number one, Dark Crystal. You've heard of it. I know you have. You might not have seen it. Fair number of you have seen it. But it's got to go on here. I've watched it a few times and I will be honest, the story's thin, but the world and the design are amazing. I love it. I have a art book that I'll show you sometime where it's some of the additional background story and world building for Dark Crystal. It's still to this day one of my favorite stories. I actually have a role playing game. I might put that one on the list for our role playing games for Dark Crystal. Alright, not much more to say about that one. The second one on the list. These come across as very children like, but I mean, that's where a lot of fantasy lands for most of history of my life. The Last Unicorn. I I watched this. I think the first time I saw this movie was a movie night for kids at the local library. This still is one of those classic movies, and it's not only a fun animated fantasy story, but it's got a little bit of a heart to it that like uh, the character of Molly, and she sees the unicorn for the first time and is like, Where were you when I was young? How dare you come to me now that I am old and like this?" And there's a line from the unicorn in the movie where she says like, "I'm I mean the unicorns are immortal, but she spent some time in the form of a mortal being, and some portion of her will remain mortal ever after." And it's like, ooh, she 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 talks about how she can feel the body dying around her. There are parts of this that really hit. They hit hard. There's a little bit of a punch there for not necessarily a kids audience, but like it's still a good movie. I remember from when I was a kid. I enjoyed it as a kid, but it has some things that punch above its childlike class. All right, third. Some of you may disagree with me about whether or not this is a fantasy movie, but I mean, this is just all around a classic movie. This is one of the best written and best done movies out there. If you've never seen The Princess Bride, it's there are very few movies that I will say like this is the model from which you need to be looking at to expand into telling fantasy style stories. There's a lot of little tricks that they use in this to make the story work in a way that otherwise it wouldn't work. But man, I will tell you, this is a perfectly executed movie. I've read the book version too, and honestly, for translating over to a movie, you don't do better than this, I don't think. Okay, next one on the list is, this is one that I'm amazed to hear that most people do not know. And it's hard to find any reference to it, partly because the name of the movie being Legend makes it hard to track down because it's a term that comes up in other searches. So it's a little hard to do. But there's an element to this, like it's not perfect. And there's a little bit of a, they don't bother to explain half of the world that they're dropping you off in the midst of. And they sort of set things in motion without really giving you the investment in the setup. But I will say, beautifully done. I feel like I could do with a mini series of this concept, flesh it out a little bit more, explore it a little more. But overall, absolutely amazing. I love the things they set in place for this movie. Okay. This one's not so old. A lot of these are 80s, but this one is much more recent. Pan's Labyrinth. I just feel like the way they handled the fantasy elements of this story, brilliantly done. You know, regardless of the brutality of the world that the characters come into, that they're existing in, the blood and the brutality and the hostility and the conflict and the terror and all those elements of it, if you put all of that aside and you put aside the special effects and makeup and all that too, if you put all of those things aside, it's still a wonderful exploration of how to do a fantasy story. But you take that gorgeous concept of how to do a fantasy story and how to incorporate it into a deeply thought-provoking and meaningful concept of a story, and you throw in the beautiful cinematography and art department work and special effects, like this is a classic. Okay, this next one's going to be a little bit funny. I have a soft spot in my soul for this one. I feel like this might be another one of those late night caught it on syndicated TV. But it's Matthew Broderick and Michelle Pfeiffer and Rutger Hauer, I believe. And the premise is thin and simple. But I do kind of like the idea of these two people who are involved in the court of an area and cursed so that they will exist at different times of the day and never interact with each other until the curse is broken. So she's a hawk during the day and he's a human. He's a wolf and she's a woman at night, if I remember correctly. I might have the night and day switched. I don't think so, but I think I got it right. And Matthew Broderick's character is Philippe the Mouse. Kind of, he's the audience surrogate brought into that story. And it's a simple concept, but it's one that I don't see a lot of fantasy media playing with anymore, and I think there's space for it. Not much more to say about that one. This one, I admit, I love it for some of the cheese. Clash of the Titans. I love the Clockwork Owl. I love the stop motion monsters. I love the dragons. Like, I remember the dragon's teeth and the skeletal warriors. I just, this is classic movie. It's not the best movie cinematography wise. It's not the best special effects, although these are all stop motion and practical special effects. So I do think this gets, for me at least, a higher rank than. I know they made a recent re-release of this one. They did a remake of Clash of the Titans, and I think it was special effects CGI heavy. I get the feeling it wasn't particularly well liked, and quite frankly, I might check it out just to see how it compares. But this holds a place in my heart. I mean, it's a little bit of a tie with Voyages of Sinbad to this one as well. But it's got the Clockwork Owl, so I think it edges out the rest of it. So it's one of my silly picks for this list, but like I said, there's not a lot of fantasy media that holds up these days anymore. So the next one is Dragon Slayer. I vaguely recall there may be some adult content in this one, but I think there's a princess sacrifice and some moderate nudity, but overall, like it. First of all, it didn't need to be in there, but this movie is quirky, but I kind of love it. It's the classic story of the apprentice wizard who thinks too much of himself, gets himself into a situation that's way over his head, and loses his master. Not because of that, but he loses his master and still thinks he's suited to the task of avenging his master or whatever. And the story's lightweight, but not so lightweight that it's not fun. Could you build a franchise off of this? Probably not. But I still think it's one of the classic top 10s that I would put out there. Okay, these last couple are going to be a little weird, and you might disagree with me about whether or not they constitute fantasy. This one, maybe. The Adventures of Baron Munchausen. Yes, that's Uma Thurman. There's also Robin Williams is in this. It's got a great cast of really well-known actors throughout the whole thing. And I understand from some of the reading I did years later when I tried to track down a copy of this again, that the director was a brutal person to work with, and most of the people who worked on there do not have fond memories of the working on the set. But I still think it's a bit of a Gulliver's Travels, a bit of a weird, wonderful cartoon physics for live action. Just like the idea of landing in the ocean with your horse, and instead of drowning, you pull yourself up by your hair. Like, it's just it's whimsical, I think is the thing I'm looking for there. There's a fantastical whimsy to the whole concept, and like I want more stories like this. It's more fun. Like the epic sagas of Tolkien and stuff, they have their place as epic fantasy. But whimsical, playful adventures of just fantastical wonder. Like I would love to see something like this for Arabian Nights or something like that. But as far as fantasy movies go, this is one of the very few that plays with this kind of storytelling that I've seen. Like, if you know of any more, let me know. If you know where I can find more like this, I would love to see more like this. And then the next one, the last one on our list, not in any particular order, is a bit like that. And it is Big Fish. Now, I am to understand that the book is not like the movie in a lot of ways. The movie is what we're talking about here. And you might disagree whether or not this is fantasy. I say it's fantasy, just in part because there's Siamese twins and giants eating sheep and a haunted forest, and yeah, they're told in such a way that even in the telling of the story, you get the sense that it's not real. But that's not the point. This is a modern day legend. In my mind, this is folk tales and legends like the legends of old as they were communicated at the time, just told by somebody who was alive when we were kids. I mean, it's got the epic journey, the adventures. So like that's one of the things about some of the ones I've chosen for this list is there's not a lot of fantasy out there for movies. If you know some that you think I would like, let me know. I'll see what I can do about taking a look at them. But in the stories that we see out there, so many of them take themselves way too seriously. And there's just kind of a magicalness to the story of the father and the big fish. There's a whimsy to Baron Munchausen. There's a wonder to The Princess Bride. I mean, the stories in this list, I think, this is one of those categories that's different enough for a particular reason. I like my fantasy books one way. I love a deep world building adventure through an epic landscape of power and majesty and wonder. A saga, a journey, a hero's journey. But my movies, my fantasy movies, I want fun, somewhat funny, but always heartwarmingly whimsical. And so I don't know that there's a lot of that out there. And like most of these on this list are unlikely to be the kinds of things that you could build a franchise or a series out of. They're one shots. The Last Unicorn, the story's one and done. Dark Crystal. I will say I did watch the Dark Crystal miniseries, and I'm upset that we didn't get more out of that. I wish we had more seasons, but Princess Bride doesn't need a sequel. Legend. I could do with some expansion of Legend. But Pan's Labyrinth, I don't know that I need more from that story. I do think I would love to see more of that type of storytelling. Ladyhawke, it's a one and done. I don't know that it needs a reboot, and I don't think it needs an expansion of the story. Clash of the Titans, I it didn't survive the reboot particularly well from what I could tell. And would I want a mini series of it? No. Dragon Slayer. No, it doesn't need anything more. I think if anything, you could try to reboot that one. And you could adjust the story a little bit more so that there's more meat to it. Adventures of Baron Munchausen, I could all day have an absolute blast of story after story. You could do 30-minute TV episodes of seasons of some of these Baron Munchausen style stories. I would love that. Big Fish, it's a self-contained story. As much as I'd love to see more of that style of story, there's not really room for a reboot. There's not room for a expansion or sequels. It's one and done. So that's sort of how I feel about each one of these on this list. This whole series, it's been hard to figure out the fantasy ones, to be honest, because it's not something we do a lot of, at least not these style of fantasy. We've done the Lord of the Rings. I'm trying to think, what other fantasy movies have we done? Narnia. I'm not big on the Narnia movies. Like, I think the books were okay. I think I read most of the books as a kid. Would we call Wind in a Doorway or what's the A Wrinkle in Time? Would we call that fantasy? I'm not sure. I know they made a couple movies, but again, the book's probably the better portion on that option. I'm trying to think, what else do we have for movies? The Sword and the Stone from Disney? If you know of some other fantasy that you think would be interesting for me to check out, let me know. Because I'd be curious to check out some of these things. Because I think it's an underdeveloped market for fantasy movies. Yeah, I'd be very curious. Now that's distinct from necessarily animated cartoon movies. I might do something on that score at some point, but that's not really where I'm mainly focused. I think the next list we're doing is short stories. I have also as options here comics, video games, anime, Japanese animation, horror movies, horror books. I don't have anything for horror books, so if you have a recommendation for horror books, you let me know. Tabletop role-playing games. I mean, that's mostly what I've got at this point. And many of these are based off of one author or one creator per list. So, like, no, that's the wrong way to phrase that. Each creator appears only once on the list. So, for a lot of the books that we did, I would totally recommend more books from Larry Niven, Anne McCaffrey, and Spider Robinson. Those are some of my favorite authors. but I limited it to one from each of them for the list. So I've done that sort of thing for every written story that we go through. But I'm willing to go back over some of those lists and pull up some other options that we didn't cover. So maybe some of the... And I'll probably do a couple lists of what I'm looking to get into. Because there's some of my to-read list that I need to get into at some certain points. So if you have recommendations and you want me to put something on a list, we can certainly take a look at some of them. But for now, it's past my bedtime. I'm out of here. Stay sane in a crazy world, guys.